Okay. So today we have with us here Mr. Kshitij Sunil Rao, a student of law at National Law University, Delhi, one of the top national law schools of India, ranked second this year in NIRF. And My association with Mr. Rao predates antiquity, perhaps. We have been passionate about the law since perhaps the ninth standard. And together we've learned various laws, we've understood various complex things about the law. We are abreast of all the happenings in the legal domain, and we complement each other in many senses in our knowledge and in our growth. So if there is someone for you to seek inspiration about, it should be Mr. Rao, because he's a champion debater. He has won many laurels for National Law University, Delhi. Most prominent of which is perhaps the Docks Bridge competition, which is an international competition in debating, and he's also involved in the publishing of two upcoming books on the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code and the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. So, if you want someone to understand the financial laws and the intricacies of them, then perhaps Mr. Rao is the best person you should approach. And we are very honored at Successpo to have him in our presence to exhort and to deliver a brilliant exposition on the law of contracts. And I'm laughing because uh, it is certainly a very happy moment for me, because I had never imagined that I would be introducing him at such a forum. So, on to you, Mr. Rao. You may begin with your lecture.
Thank you, Avanish. Thank you for those kind words. So, guys, before I start with the lecture, just a few pointers. What I'll be majorly covering today are two broad points. Firstly, lawful consideration and lawful object, what these two things basically are and the distinction between them. And secondly, the rule of severability, meaning that if you've gone to the court saying that a particular agreement is void and cannot be enforced, to what degree can the court separate the meat from the remaining part so that it is still enforceable? That is what I'll be covering in this lecture. Before that, if you have any doubts midway, just put it in the chat box, so you can also unmute yourselves and just start speaking. And if I'm going too quickly or too slow, please do let me know and I'll adjust accordingly. So, starting with, so the section that primarily deals with lawful consideration and lawful object is section 23 of the ICA 1862, the Indian Contracts Act 1862, which is, by its very nature, it was one of the first few enactments in relation to the Indian law, one which of course continues till date, but is one that was having a lot more progressive provisions as opposed to other laws. And for a little digression on that subject, take for instance, the US Supreme Court, where there was quite a lot of tussle regarding contract law in and of itself being private law on one aspect. Secondly, the right to arbitrate on the second aspect. And thirdly, a provision in an agreement that disallows people from moving to courts. So these three scorching hydra heads came together to come out with a new jurisprudence. That is, to what degree can in agreements you disallow people from entering into courts? Now, this was the case because in their own enactment of contract law, there wasn't a clear cut picture of what is to happen. Now, this was completely different in our own law, the Indian Contract Act. Because if you look at section 27 of the same, it talks about all agreements that restrain your right to go to court is void. Exception 1, the right to arbitrate. So this entire litigation was something that the Indian courts were never subject to because of this progressive provision being there in our Indian law. That being the case, coming back to lawful object and lawful consideration. But again, before I move into that, just a quick note on what is it that Section 23 fundamentally does. Section 23, in its essence, restricts your right to contract. Now, in your previous classes, you already know what is your right to contract, but it is, in essence, a private right. Meaning, you, wherever you live in the country or somewhere apart, it is not that you require the permission of the court to enter into an agreement. It is not the case that you require a decree or a notice that you would then subsequently be allowed to contract. The right to contract is a private right. Now, this private right being something that you are allowed to have, why is it that the court can restrict your right to contract? Now, this question was raised in the 1700s, where Lord Mansfield gave rather proper and expounded the law in a beautiful manner. Now, it is a paper that I wrote as well, and the justification for restricting your right to contract, it being private in nature, can be found in this rather wonderful theorem called as the paradox of expansion of rights. Now, what does it essentially mean? You are given a certain set of rights which you can exercise and can contract for. Take, for example, A can contract with B for sale of iPhones, then B with C for some MacBooks, etc., etc. It can go on and on and on. Now, when you look at it in the broader scheme of things from a utilitarian perspective, that is to say, that if everybody's right to contract is taken into consideration, you'll find that there are certain people who are at a natural disadvantage, and there are certain people who are at a natural advantage. These advantages can be further categorized into the following headings. Firstly, information asymmetry. What does it mean? That by virtue of you having more information about a particular land or a particular article or a particular object, you're able to get a favorable contract as opposed to the other one. Number two, the idea of you having a degree of, one second, I'll just open my paper. Yes. Secondly, having a degree of epistemic access. This is extremely important. You'll not find it anywhere else. Now, what is epistemic access? It means fundamentally the ability to know your position once a contract is formed. Now, a lot of people, yes, they have the information that this would be my position after a contract is formed, but they might not know how it would feel once the contract is formed, and they are in that position of the contract being formed and they having been forced by the court to do certain duties. And lastly, we have vulnerability, which simply is that by virtue of not everyone being equal in this wonderful country, some people are more vulnerable than others, and therefore there is an asymmetry. By virtue of there being these three broad asymmetries in the populace, the court, in order to maximize as a whole from a utilitarian perspective the right of every person, is allowed to restrict certain forms of contract. So what I have just told you is the justification for the restriction of the right to contract, or in other words, on what basis was Section 23 introduced in the ICA. How can you introduce this? Because for every provision, there must be some degree of justification, assuming you think that, yes, they have brains. So that is what I have just told you. Any doubts relating to this? I believe none. So now let's go to Section 23 and what it is. A reading of the Bare Act. The consideration or object of an agreement is lawful unless it is forbidden by law, or is of such a nature that if permitted it would defeat the provisions of any law, or is fraudulent, or involves or implies injury to the person or property of another, or the court regards it as immoral or opposed to public policy. In each of these cases, the consideration or object of an agreement is said to be unlawful. Every agreement of which the object or consideration is unlawful is void. Now, it is a very long section and forms a major chunk of your questions that come relating to the Indian Contracts Act in CLAT, ILET, and all these papers. So, it is extremely important for you to understand this section in depth. So, first, what is this distinction between an unlawful consideration and unlawful object? Would anyone care to expound on it? What do you think is the difference between unlawful consideration and unlawful object? Uh, okay. Yes, Mr. Alam Khan.
Sir, when we say unlawful consideration, we need to know what consideration is. So I'll tell that, like, it is something which is given to enter into a contract that is enforceable in the court of law. So when we speak of consideration, it should be legal, it should not be illegal, and it should not include illicit things like drugs or weapons we can count in. And when we say unlawful object, we are talking about the objective of the agreement. It should not go against the law.
Very well, thank you. So I believe that is essentially what the difference is. But just to summarize what Alam just said, object can be, for the purpose of your exam, be replaced with the word purpose. For instance, and for consideration, you obviously have studied it. Consideration on part of one person is the act or promise that they're going to do on the other person, that being the case. If it is there, then only you can have a valid contract. It is the act, omission, or a promise to do an act or omission, blah, blah, blah. So that being distinct from the object, that is, that once that consideration is done from party A to party B and a subsequent consideration from party B to party A, there is an end result that happens. There is something that has now occurred. If I give 10 rupees to someone, if I give 18 rupees to Mr. Avanishkar and he returns me goods, there is some transaction that has taken place. Sale of good has taken place. Sale of good being the ultimate purpose or object which has occurred. Now, that being the case, the consideration, obviously you understood, is quite different. So the word unlawful object is the purpose, and the word unlawful consideration is the thing that you're actually doing. Going into the details of it now. Now, a contract of buying or selling land can in and of itself be valid, because the consideration is of giving money, and for the other person, the transfer of land that is taking place. But that contract becomes void, or rather that agreement becomes unenforceable, because that's sort of a paradox. A contract cannot be unenforceable because then it's not a contract. But moving quickly ahead, that agreement cannot be enforced if it is the case that the state in which the contract was made has certain land ceilings. i.e., that if you already have 50 acres of land and assuming the ceiling is of 52, I contract with you, which ultimately leads into you having 55 acres of land. Now, this object of the contract is unlawful. Why? Because the commission of it would lead to you committing an unlawful act, that is, breaching the land ceiling norms of a particular state. That being the case, you have the idea of unlawful object. Quickly dealing with unlawful consideration, which is quite obvious. It can be out of a variety of things. Number one, anything that is mentioned in the IPC, right? If you have consideration that I'll commit murder if you give me some 50,000 pounds, that's obviously unlawful and is made void by Section 23. Secondly, if you have anything that is perhaps the unwritten law of the land, if you have things that is contrary, even though a lot of the common law principles are now codified, take for instance in Copra and all that, but if you have something that is unwritten, but still is something that the court considers as being good, a principle of law, and you contract to frustrate that thing, that is obviously void in law. But what do I really mean by that? And okay, let's just take for instance that this is unwritten rule that no governor that he himself is from a particular state, they themselves are from a particular state, cannot be the governors of that very state. This is an unwritten rule. You'll not find it in the constitution. You'll not find it anywhere else. But this is extremely important. And if you form a contract that frustrates this entire process, you're doing something that is fundamentally wrong. A variety of other things can be found. Also, you have all the principles of personal law covered, any sort of consideration that essentially involves you committing an act that is against the personal laws, that is against, that is an offense mentioned in the IPC, blah, 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 is obviously void. You cannot contract to do that. Any questions? Any doubts, anything you want me to like say again or go into the depths of? That'll also be fine. Yes, Agastya Shukla.
Can you please give one more example where there is a lawful consideration but unlawful object?
There is, can you repeat your question?
Uh, Lawful consideration but unlawful purpose or unlawful object.
Okay, yeah. Absolutely. So, okay, I'll just go into the depths of it, right? So, unlawful object can be of two kinds. Number one, where it is unlawful by because of the purpose that it reaches, and secondly, by its very design. Now, what is the purpose? One second. Yes. Now, what is the purpose? Take for instance, okay, cool. So PMLA, so the Public Prevention of Money Laundering Acts, there's a confiscation order against a particular property under Section 5, Subclause 1. Now, for that confiscation order, you automatically grant an injunction that no other rights can accrue out of it, right? So you can't contract for the sale of that particular land because of the moratorium that then or the injunction that happens because of the PMLA Act. That being the case, you now contract with the person who is accused under PMLA saying that I want to take this land from you. That person is unaware and he's paying proper money. The other person perhaps might be aware or might not be aware. That is irrelevant. But once that sale happens, the payment of money is of course legal. The sale of land is of course legal. But ultimately, that leads to a contravention or a disturbance or a sort of a tussle with Section 5, Subclause 1 of the PMLA Act, where the confiscation orders have already been passed and no encumbrances, further encumbrances can further accrue out of that very property. So the ultimate purpose, the object, is void. Is that good? Would you want more? Okay, let me just continue on this more then. Now, what is... okay, there's a message. Objective, buying land, consideration, using heroin to pay for it. Can we consider this example as lawful object but unlawful consideration? But unlawful consideration. Yes, perhaps you can consider it that way. But I would also say that in this case, your object is also to use heroin as legal tender, and also the transfer of heroin from one person to another, because that is also an ancillary purpose. So, that being the case, you're obviously gone in NDPS and are not getting bail. So I don't think that'll be an apt example. Okay, but going quickly into a bit more detail on unlawful object. So there are other ones that deal with not by virtue of their purpose, but by design. Now, yes, purpose is to a certain degree important, but by and large, the making it void happens by virtue of the design of the contract. Now, what do I mean by this? Take, for instance, you are contracting with someone for wagering things, right? That you want to wager on someone, on something, on some race or some IPL thing that's going on. Now, for that thing, the consideration in and of itself is fine. You're paying someone money when Sachin hits a six and the other person is paying if he hits a four or something of that sort. I don't know how it works. So that in and of itself is not void. But by the design of it and the purpose it ultimately reaches, the court decides that we will not enforce it. We are making it void. So that is more on the unlawful object. Is that fine, Augusta?
Yes, absolutely fine. I have another question which is on the chat box. May I read it?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Similar to object, does the unlawful consideration also have some bifurcations regarding to purpose or design or something like that?
I'll get into it in a moment.
All right, thank you.
Okay. This is done. Okay, lastly, then that the presumption that the court always has is of legality. Meaning that if you go to the court saying that I want to void this, the presumption would always be, because the court presumes that people are sane and they would never contract for something that is illegal. And why would they want to do it? Because they wouldn't contract for it. Even if they're doing like some illegal stuff, they'll just do it. They wouldn't formally contract for that to happen because they know it's obviously unenforceable. Why would you do that? So the presumption in the minds of courts and judges as a result of it is that it is legal. It is upon the plaintiff to prove that, hey guys, this is unlawful. You're done with that. Another part of it, the motive. Now, okay, no questions. Yeah, motive. Section 23 doesn't really care about motive. What do I mean by that? And also by virtue of it being a civil act in general, it cares about motive pretty much never. So that what do I essentially mean by that? It means that, take for example, I want to bribe a judge. I want to bribe Dhananjay Yashwant Chandrachud. Okay. Now I contract with Agastya for the sale of land so that I get 1 crore rupees so that I can ultimately bribe DY Chandrachud. Now that contract is perfectly valid in law. Why? Because it does not matter whether I ultimately want to bribe DY Chandrachud. It is the act of bribing DY Chandrachud that would be bad in law, for which I'll be put in jail for quite a lot of years, but not the fact that I had that sale of land. So motive with respect to that is essentially non-existent, something that the court doesn't really care about. Yeah, another quick example, that a gift deed in favor of a woman, the object of which was past cohabitation, still remains a valid contract, irrespective of the motivation, right? So even though if it was okay, I'll get to that in a moment, but just a brief snippet, that if it was a contract for that concubination to take place, then of course it would have been void. But still, since it does not mention of that thing in the contract, and it is only the motivation that is later than that comes into picture and the person pays for it. Before that thing has taken place, it is perfectly fine. You're just paying money for something and just a gift deed is taking place. All right then. Forbidden by law, a part of section 23. Now this is the subdivisions for consideration. You can look at it in that way. There are 3 subdivisions into forbidden by law. Firstly, the provision of any statute, be it a state or centrally legislated, within which is obviously the entire IPC. You cannot contract for doing anything that is made an offense under the Indian Penal Code. Secondly, the rules of personal law, be it Hindu law, Mohammedan law, also the unwritten principles of it. And thirdly, other rules that are in whatever, that are in stay while your contract is being formed. Take, for instance, I mean, like the major provisions, the Rent Control Act of a particular state, special legal provisions that are mentioned. You can't go against them when you're forming your contract. Again, the presumption obviously remains of legality. Any questions till now? Anything you would want me to elaborate more on? You can just speak if you have anything. I guess not. Great. Now, dealing with the 2 types of prohibitions, right? Or moving into details of the legislation / rules that the legislature has expounded, and telling you that in which case is a contravention of it acceptable. What do I mean by that? Take, for example, you have a contract that breaches certain provisions of a Act X, and you have another contract that breaches certain provisions of Act Y. In which case would the contract be void, and in which case it would not be void? That depends upon the wording of the provision that is there in the legislation. What do I mean by that? What are these 2 broad distinctions? First, for the protection of revenue and for administrative ease, and secondly, for the good of the general public. It is only in the second case that a contract that is in violation of the provision would be termed as void. And for the first case, it would obviously not be termed void. What do I mean by it, and some examples for it? Now, if you have a contract that is made in a state that prescribes certain rules during agreements between a tenant and a tenant, right? In that rules, there is, let's say, one provision that says in the State Act that you must first get this registered under some inspector. And now during the formation of the contract, you forgot about this and you just went ahead with it. In this particular case, your contract would not be void, because the provision that is there in the statute is not one that is for the greater public good, but on the contrary, is for administrative ease and for the easier collection of revenue. Why is that the case? Because once that particular inspector knows that, okay, cool, you now have this particular room being rented to this person, I can then now get all my whatever stuff for notices that I want from this person, and the name has now changed in all these documents. That being the case, it essentially is for administrative ease and not for the broader public good. On the contrary, for the broader public good, you have don't commit murder. That is for the broader public good, right? Also, then, most importantly, are rent legislations, right? That no landowner can charge more than a particular rent. That no tenant can take more than a particular prescribed area for a particular amount of money, blah, blah, blah. All these rent legislations are found to be for the broader public good for obvious reasons, right? So that more and more people can at net, looking at it from a utilitarian perspective, get the maximum amount of utility. These cases are obviously covered under 23, and the previous one mentioned, those relating to administrative ease and the collection of revenue, stand ultra virus to it. Any questions till now? Anything you would like to know more about? Apart from section 23 also you can ask. Okay, I believe none. We have only 3 parts left now. We have public policy, we have immorality, and lastly, a bit more discussion on severability. And that would be it. So public policy. Okay, very good question. Can you please explain doctrine of transfer of malice? Doctrine of transfer of malice. Alim Khan, could you please tell me what you mean by it and also its relevance to section 23? Is it valid in India? You can do a Google search for it. I'm quite unaware of it. Though I am
that's a concept in criminal law. It is a strictly, it's a strictly criminal law concept. I think what he meant by apart from section 23 is related to the Contract Act, obviously.
Yeah, I mean,
let's just restrict our discussion to that. We'll get onto that question when we study criminal law.
Most certainly. And you can also text me if you want a detailed study of it. I could send you some journal articles regarding the transfer of malice. Okay, so since you have no further questions of 23, let me continue. Public policy and immorality. Now, section 23 obviously does not define the word public policy. Even more importantly, no provision of ICA defines public policy. Also then, no legislation by the central government defines public policy. And it is in this liquid state, in this vague nature of it, that you find true utility. That it is because of it not being defined, and as a result of it, strict interpretation not something that the court can resort to, that the courts have ultimately used these words in a manner in which they like. Now, not going into the wisdom of it, but just dealing with the power that the court then has with respect to public policy, I've already elaborated on it is only in these cases that the contract would be void. But moving just a bit more on it, it is based on the fundamental claim, the Latin maxim, which all of you guys must now be remembering, ex dolo malo non oritur actio, meaning that a claim to justice cannot arise out of illegality. The illegality in this case being the act against public policy. Because once you're going to court saying that I want to enforce this particular contract, if the contract in and of itself contains something that is against public policy, your hands are not clean and the court would not go ahead and enforce that particular contract. Second last on immorality. Now, immorality is again not a word that is defined either in ICA or in subsequent legislations of the central or perhaps even state government. It is only for the court to determine that what is immoral according to today's standards. Because 370 might be immoral according to the Victorian standards, but today it is not, and therefore needs to be struck down by the Supreme Court. So they, now being given the power to adjudge what is immorality, have in the vast majority of cases restricted immorality to sexual immorality. They haven't gone into the broader aspect of what the word immoral in a philosophical sense might mean, and therefore come up with a good jurisprudence on that subject. But interestingly, then there was a judgment of the Supreme Court wherein a commission to a dealer in order to induce a third person to pay a substantially higher price for property worth much less was found to be immoral and not against public policy. Now, yes, it can be against public policy, but it was struck down on the ground of it being immoral, meaning that in pith and substance, that if you look at it as a whole, it is immoral and not broadly opposed to public policy. That being perhaps an ancillary issue if it ever comes to be an issue in that case. So in terms of immorality, you obviously have concubinage, you have the idea of, if being a Hindu, having contracting for 3-4 wives, if or general pimping is something that is immoral, any contract with respect, in respect of it, is immoral, the court would not enforce it, blah blah blah. Before I move into severability, which is the last big topic of today, any questions? Yes, Agastya.
This is just arising out of curiosity that how do judges particularly define the meaning of public policy in their interpretation and morality? Like, how do they go the process? What is the process? Like, how do they articulate it very well? So, just out of curiosity, I asked. Nothing in particular.
Wonderful question, and others can also ask all these. Okay, how do courts determine that what is immoral and what is moral? Now there are, once you get into law school in your first year, you learn about schools of thought, right, of law, which talk about that why is it that a particular law or a particular exposition of law is a way that it currently is. It leads to an automatic and an invariable categorization of judges and reasoning that this set of judgments is because of this, and this set of judgments is because of this. To ground more this abstract concept, you have rules such as it being a realist school of thought, and they say that the judgment of the court is what the judge ate in breakfast, right? That it is not really based on law, that there are no precedents, that you can always find a precedent if you've made up your mind, which is something that personally I do agree with. And it ultimately depends upon the mood of the judge. So if you take that view, immorality is what the judge had in breakfast. If his mood is good, then he perhaps might pass a judgment that is favorable to you. Secondly, you have the naturalist point of law, the naturalist viewpoint of law. What does it say? It says that law is not something that is only written in the books. There is another lecture of Justice Nariman, which one of you could text me later, I'll send it to you, where the first judge's case was being discussed, where the word concurrence was read into the word consultation with respect to the appointment of judges. I hope all of you know about it. And Mr. Nariman says, while quoting some other author, and I quote, that, "Oh, you fool, you are stuck on the bark of words. Where has this grammar taken you? Nowhere." And therefore the court developed this idea of principles yielding to words, that it is not particular words that matter, it is the principle that matter. The principle in that case being the independence of judiciary. Therefore, the word consultation must bow down to the word concurrence. Quickly moving back. So the naturalists say that it is not just the books that matter, it is not just the precedents that matter, it is the world at large that matters. Look around, see in nature how the law is, and then form an opinion that is holistic. Now, I wouldn't know what a naturalist perspective to immorality is, but you can, of course, Google search it. Lastly, you have positivists, which are by and large most of the judges, where the law is decided by the legislature, they make laws, the Supreme Court is given the responsibility of declaring the law, of interpreting the constitution, and that is it. Don't go into nature, don't trust your breakfast and decide it on that basis. But giving a direct answer to Agastya's question, the Supreme Court in Gerulal Parak versus Mahadev Das Maiva notes that the word immoral varies depending upon time and the stage of civilization the humankind is. And the word immorality is something that is fluid. Now, of course, unlike a lot of other things upon which Supreme Court gives a 10-page detailed outlook that this constitutes this constitutes X, Y, and Z, the court has not given one for immorality, for it to be an expansive definition, for more things to come into it. So we don't really know how the court really came to the view that pimping is something that is immoral. It just did, right? By looking at Hindu law, and once you go back to it. Yes, Mr. Kar.
So I would like to add on to something over here. So I had given this example in my class as well that so I had given this example in my class that recently there was this patent application in India about a sex toy. So this sex toy was not considered to be a moral object by the patent authorities. So this discretion was exercised by them. So these things happen, that there are debates that occur among the legislature, the judiciary, the executive, that what constitutes something to be moral or not. And this is something that varies from judge to judge, as Mr. Rao said, that it merely depends on the mood of the judge and his upbringing, most likely, and what school of thought he subscribes to. There is no standard definition of morality, but some things appear immoral on the face of it and universally. Let's say there is, how many of you have seen Squid Game? Okay, so Anshika, what happens in Squid Game? Okay, no one has seen Squid Game? Okay, so Squid Game is basically, should I get into it or do you want no spoilers about it? Are you planning to see it? Okay, the point is, बोल दो भैया. Okay. So वहां पे क्या होता है कि स्क्विड गेम एक ऐसा एक गेम है जो लोगों को डेट अकर होता है, जो लोग कर्जे में डूबे हुए होते हैं, वो क्या करते हैं, वो एक गेम में पार्टिसिपेट करते हैं जिसमें बहुत सारे स्टेजेस होते हैं. उस स्टेज में आप फेल हो गए तो आपको मार दिया जाएगा. ठीक है, तो ये तो एक तो इलीगल है, बट लीविंग असाइड इट्स इलीगैलिटी, it's immoral on the face of it. There is no judge in this world who would agree that this is moral. That you can't say that the doctrine of voluntary non-fit injury extends to such an extent that you will allow people to kill you just because you are in debt. So there are certain absolute things in this debate between morality and immorality, but largely it is something that is subjective and depending on the school of thought that the judge subscribes to, as Mr. Rao said.
Oh, wonderful points there, Mr. Ka. So just coming back, yeah, pimping is obviously immoral in any contract for that. is void. Surprisingly enough, prostitution is not uh, made void by the court. So if you yourself, without a pimp, have a contract that essentially is prostitution, it is not something that the court would term as void. So that is the funny aspect of it. Lastly, quickly moving into severability. Now, what is severability, right? And you'd obviously heard about this from Mr. Kerr as well. It essentially means that if the court has the ability to save a contract, then that discretion must be exercised. How is that exercised? The rule given by the Supreme Court in Shin Satellite Public Co. Limited versus Jan Studios is the following. Severance can be effected when the part severed can be removed by running a blue pencil through it. Now, obviously, the word blue pencil has no meaning or has no relevance. It could have also been a red pencil. But the point that is being made is that there should be a clear-cut separation in the contract that now allows it to become legal. Proviso number one, the contract must still remain substantial post the severance. What do I mean by that? That if during the severance you now have no consideration, that the consideration is something that you've severed out of the contract, then obviously it is not a contract anymore by virtue of it not having any consideration. So the substantial part of the contract must remain there, unsevered, untouched. Only the illegality is being taken away with one plain cut of the pencil. Now, it is not the details of the pencil and all that matter. It could be blue or anything. It's called the blue pencil rule if it ever comes in your paper. That is the rule of severability, because the court also in the vast majority of cases tries to save the contract because some amount of consideration usually has already taken place. So if you directly void it, then one person might suffer some losses, assuming it is not possible for the specific relief to occur. Then some person might have to suffer a lot. So it is that the court finds ways to sever the illegality out of it and make the contract good in law. That brings me to the end of section 23 of the Indian Contracts Act. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please do let me know. And here's my...
So at this stage, you can be asking him questions also about your preparation and preparation journey and everything. At this forum, you can ask questions that are outside the scope of what he delivered substantively.
Most certainly, you can ask me questions relating to number one, ICA, number two, CLAT ILET, number three, the law schools and the culture of it. And in detail, I won't go into for obvious reasons. Number four, you can ask me about constitutional law, about double aspect theory, and also about any judge that you might find interesting. And yeah, I mean, pretty much everything apart from something on the lines of doctrine of transfer of malice. I hope you get it. Yep. Any questions? You have a rather reticent set of students, Mr. Kerr.
Perhaps they are taking time to acclimatize themselves with you, Mr. Rao.
Perhaps. But given our association for such a long period of time, I think invariably there would be a substantial overlap between your teaching style and mine.
I think that is a fiction that is created by you, Mr. Rao. I think I would have them attest to the fact that I explain in a very less didactic fashion than you do.
Oh, most certainly. Perhaps it might be because of the high dosage of Mr. Nariman that I'm getting nowadays.
Yes, very likely that's the reason. अरे यार तुम लोग पूछो यार इनसे सवाल मतलब he will answer. He has a lot of exposure to law school life and everything, so you can ask him about how to go about solving questions, how to go about attempting the paper. So yes, finally a relevant question that came up.
Finally,
Yes.
please share your IELTS preparation journey. That how did you prepare for it and what was your approach? Okay, so I must first start with a proviso, and that too an important one. That being this, that how's NLUD all over? Uh, well, okay, let me answer this before then. I'd say NLU Delhi opens a host of opportunities for you. You'll be given opportunities that you perhaps might not be given if you go to certain other universities. Of course, uh, top 5, top 6 still being there. But there is a presumption that happens when you're at NLUD that you're competent, that you are able to do certain tasks and you'll do them pretty well. That's the good part. Secondly, you have great databases. Thirdly, you have a great library. In terms of professors, I think by and large it's the same. 90% of the people sleep in class. Professors, you'll find 3 or 4 good professors in every university. Apart from that, I want to understand IBC. How do I start over? Well, I think the biggest authority that you can find on IBC is Mr. Kar. He can teach you every bit of it, uh, also including the accounting guidelines, also including the Indian Council of Chartered Accountants, all the manuals provided by them. So you must please DM Mr. Kar. However, insofar as my suggestion is to go, I would say buy this book by by the Vadhva Law Chambers. It's the Guide to Insolvency and Bankruptcy Court. It's a 2-volume book. Buy it, read it. Also, you can, I've already given you my number. I'll tell you how to read a professional book on particular acts because you don't read them like a novel. So that I'll do for you. Just text me on WhatsApp. Coming back to how's NLUD all over. So yeah, the professors 2-3 you'll find great in every university. Apart from that, rest are not that great. So yeah, 90% of people sleep in classes. For certain, like 100% people sleep. Apart from that, NLUD, it's been fine. It's the romanticizing of it ends quite soon. The high of oh my god, I'm in such a great law school ends really soon. There's immense competition, quite cutthroat, and every time somebody achieves something, you'll feel why am I not that one? So you'll be pushing yourself throughout. It's not 5 years of pure joy, it's 5 years of pure hard work, assuming your father is not Fali Nariman. If he is, then you can do whatever you like. But apart from that, but yeah, I'll not scare you guys much. There are also people who chill out quite a lot because see, once you're in really good law schools, you're obviously getting a job, and that too, not a bad one. You're getting 1 lakh minimum, even if you're a very bad student. So if you want that, then cool. Like a lot of people in my uni also, they don't give a damn about anything. Don't give a damn about any extracurricular, even though they come for ADR, which is what we call a free plane ticket without any mehnat. So yeah, I mean that sort of people are also there. You just have to choose your thing if you really want to be that. Oh, I continuously have to do something or the other. No, uh, 1 lakh per month, Aisha. If you're in a really good law school. So yeah, I mean it's pretty sorted. NLUD otherwise, yeah, it's great when you tell other people. According to you, what skills an aspirant should acquire from now to do good in law school and the field? That's an interesting question. I just crack your exam right now, and that's it. Like you'll do well. Okay, but in general, I'd say debate. Okay, I'll say two things. Firstly, to articulate yourselves in a manner that you can explain your thoughts lucidly. Secondly, to dissect complex propositions, complex statements, complex paragraphs into much more meaningful sentences so that you're able to comprehend them. Essentially, number one is that saying so that people comprehend, and second is your ability to comprehend. If you can master these two things, you're pretty much sorted for law school and also ahead of that. Because that's what essentially is. You read a particular paragraph, somebody else goes like, I just don't know what the hell it's saying. And you read it and you're like, okay, this is saying this thing. And they're like, oh yeah, it's saying this thing. And that's essentially what every bit of law school is. Jordan Peterson would make a great lawyer then. He certainly would. Agastya. Absolutely. Any tips for introvert students to get well versed with the law school environment? Okay. I'd say this.
I think better than Kshitij, who is an inherent extrovert, we
Oh,
have.
Mr. Gar, INTP, INTP. Please
No,
don't.
that is a bogus test. But we have Farhanaz Hazari here, who's a second year student of law at MNLU Mumbai. She and I also we go back a long way. So I think she can answer this question better about how to deal with law school as an introvert. Farhanaz, would you like to? Okay.
He has asked to be texted.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll just give you something on introverts. So I'd say, and this is something we learned in 9th grade, I believe, that there is a distinction between, so it's like journalists can also be introverts. A person whose primary occupation is to interact with people can also be an introvert. So just keep this in mind that it is not some inherent barrier that is disallowing you from reaching out to people. You can do it as well. And merely because you're an introvert, i.e., a person who enjoys being with themselves and it's great for them, which I do too, doesn't necessarily mean that you can't talk to people, right? So, in terms of just advice on law school, just don't hold yourself back. Do everything possible. Do debates. I remember I sweared 43 times in my first debate, and I got a fourth, which is the last position in the first debate I did. And but right now, no second year or perhaps even third year in India has as many credentials as I do in terms of debating. But yeah, right. So just don't hold back simply because if debating isn't working for you, or you get like a bad result in the first time, in the second time, in the third time, like it'll eventually work out. So just keep doing a lot of stuff, throw yourselves into a lot of positions. You'll learn, you'll grow, and you'll generally become a better person than you were yesterday. So yeah, regardless of being an introvert, just do everything that is there in law school. Please highlight the importance of English language in the law school and the field and how to improve it. Okay. Very frank, it is of utmost importance. And if you want to be at the top of this profession, you cannot survive without having great English. Full stop. It is how it is. I remember Mr. Datar talking about it in the Madras Bar Association. He gave a lecture in which he said that it is good that all of us are very proud of our state language. Everybody wants to speak Madrasi and Tamil, all that. Marathi, everybody is proud that, oh, Marathi Manus and all that. But if you want to be at the top of the profession, if you want to be practicing in the Supreme Court, arguing in the Supreme Court, or perhaps later want to become QC, you can't survive without being great at English. And if you look at any of these lawyers, Palkiwala, Sirway, Daftari, I mean, I could go on listing a lot of them. None of them, all of them rather, had great English and command over the language. So it is immensely important. In terms of how is it that you could develop it, I think before ninth grade, I couldn't really speak English properly. Yeah, I was pretty bad at it. So it's something that you can obviously learn. Just watch as many videos as possible on YouTube, watch movies, listen to lectures, especially by Justice Nariman Chandrachud and by Datar. Just give me 10 seconds, guys. I'll be back.
Aisha, please don't refer to pop culture that much. See, there is a distinction, of course, between the higher judiciary and the lower judiciary. If you are practicing at a Gurgaon district court, then if you speak in English, then you're deemed doomed to lose. There is no way out of it. You have to speak in Hindi. No prejudice to the Gurgaon district court judges, but that is how it works. But if you are appearing before, let's say, a Bombay High Court bench or a Supreme Court bench, then you invariably have to speak in English. But even in Bombay High Court, I think I've heard from a few people that certain submissions go on in Marathi, and even in Gujarat High Court, they go on in Gujarati. But the point is not that. You have to be good in English to be taken seriously in this profession, because you see all the great senior advocates, they are all very proficient in English. In corporate law, if you don't want to practice the law in the traditional sense, if you go to corporate law, then you have to be very proficient in writing things, drafting complex things, and for that you need to be very proficient in English, which is exactly why our CLAT examination pattern has changed, so that it filters out people who are not proficient in understanding English. Whether that is equitable or not is a separate debate, but whether it is necessary or not is, again, another debate. But so I would suggest you, if you are not good in English, don't feel that your life is over. You certainly can learn it. I myself have learned many languages without not having any family background in it. So it's just about effort and dedication to the cause, and you can achieve it. Like Kshitij said, read a lot, see a lot of YouTube videos of different people, of different manners of English speaking. So that is more important than, let's say, just sticking yourself to textbooks. That is how you will develop yourself.
Yes, and and Mr.
Yes.
Carr would obviously agree with it, that in the vast majority of instances, you'll find that the people who have heard more English are much better than the people who have read more English. It's good that a lot of people say reading for developing English, but I personally, from my own experience and also of the experience of Mr. Carr, would suggest that listen to more English, right? Listen to lectures by great people who speak great English, and you'll become great at it.
And ultimately, what matters is your content. Even if you have a great command over the language, you can't overcome the fact that all that you have is gas within you, that you can't um, form a logical argument. So the first step is to be logical. Before English, you have to be logical. You have to have a manner of thinking that is crystal clear. Only then will you succeed. English, of course, adds on to that because it's the medium of expression of your thoughts. But if your thoughts themselves are not that great, then you can't achieve anything in this profession. You should choose another profession, perhaps engineering or something. Just kidding. No contempt to the engineers, but yes, you have to be fluid in your thinking. You have to think on your feet. You have to be ready to work hard. And this is a profession of people who are serious. But of course, this is a profession of people who also know how to have fun, because you can't be serious all the time. And you should be well-rounded and just be focused on your exam now. And the whole purpose of this exercise was to instill in you the ability to understand someone's speak very complex things and understand them, break them down. And I'm sure a lot of you must not have understood the entire lecture completely, but that is okay at this stage. The whole idea was to acquaint you with these terms and to uh, get you equipped with the ability to understand these things, which will develop gradually. Uh, yes. What skill, Geetika?
They are thinking logically and arguing in a proper manner.
Yes. So my methodology of teaching is that I always ask people to read things and people to explain them, and I of course interject in between, like exposing the lacunae in their arguments, so that they know what to think and what not to think, what is logical and what is not logical, and they get a solid intellectual bedrock to be in this profession. Um, is there any other question? Please, you may ask Kshitij or me or Farhanaz also. Uh, we are here.
And I would also suggest that you must read this book titled Legends in Law by Sudhish V. Pai. It is a book that contains very short biographies of the great lawyers that we've known. And if you just read it, you get immense motivation, and which almost surprisingly is quite disproportionate to the effort that you're putting in just reading 3-4 pages. But the motivation that you get as a result of it is quite immense. So get that book, get hold of it, and obviously Courtroom Genius being mandatory, just read some parts of it. But this book, by if you want to just read anything for motivation in terms of law, this is a wonderful, wonderful book. It has the lives of C.K. Daftari, Sirvai, Palkiwala, Soli, Nariman, all the great Parsi lawyers. It has the lives of all of them. Just go through it. You'll be motivated to work hard and get into this profession, which nowadays does not have a great name for it, but at a point surely did. So that would be one special recommendation. Apart from that, listen to the lecture of Nani Palkiwala, and somebody could just note it and put it in the chat box. That first, I would say, listen to Mr. Harish Salve talking about Mr. Nani Palkiwala. It is titled that Nani Palkiwala is the tallest man I have ever seen. Second, listen to Mr. Iqbal Chagla talk about Nani Palkiwala, and he tells you about the brilliance of Nani Palkiwala. And thirdly, then watch an entire speech by the greatest advocate this country has ever seen, just to see that what is it that made him the greatest. That what is it in Nani Palkiwala that everybody is going mad about. And you'll find this entire 1 hour 10-minute speech by Nani Palkiwala delivered in 1971 in Madras in a function that was chaired by Mr. Rajagopalachari at that point of time. These three things are must watch. I mean, it's gold. So yeah, that'll be it for now. Let me know if you want more YouTube recommendations, because I actually have plenty. That's a major part of my life anyways, watching all of this. So yeah, any questions and all? Okay, more on YouTube recommendations. Okay, done. So, okay, I've given you these. Watch Janak Dwarkadas giving a lecture in the Bombay court, that lawyers association. It's titled Art of Advocacy by Janak Dwarkadas. Wonderful, wonderful lecture. He also talks about Fali Nariman and all other lawyers and their way of speaking, how it is something that would persuade the court. and all that. So that is another one. I would also recommend you to watch every bit of Justice Nariman that is available on the internet. Every bit of it. Because it is practically the impossible being performed in front of you, and fortunately enough being recorded on YouTube. The man speaks with no paper, no reference, no guide, and can literally cite date after date after date, so obscure that you'll scratch your head. So listen to every bit of Justice Nariman. In terms of the list or the order that I would say, first and foremost, listen to the lecture delivered by Justice Nariman in the Supreme Court Bar Association. It's a 3-part lecture. It is a lecture on the 3 great Chief Justices the world has seen: Lord Mansfield, Lord Chief Justice John Marshall of the US Supreme Court, and our own Justice B.K. Mukherjee, who presided over the Supreme Court for 4.5 years, only second to Y.V. Chandrachud. That is a great one by Justice Nariman. Second, you can hear Justice Nariman on the guardian angels of fundamental rights. He talks about Palkiwala, about assisting him in Minerva Mills, etc., etc. And actually watch all of Mr. Fali Nariman's lectures. I think most of you here would be fans of Karunanandi. Is that the case? How many of you are fans of Karunanandi? A show of hands. Like, just raise your hand if you are. Oh, none. Quite surprising. What I would say, there's a lecture by Fali Nariman, an interview conducted by Karunanandi with Fali Nariman. It's amazing. And also every bit of Fali Nariman is again quite interesting, quite amazing, quite worthwhile watching. So that is also great. Yeah, that is it in terms of YouTube recommendation. And also, last but not the least, obviously not the least, he's the guru of Mr. Avnishkar and me, Mr. Arvind P. Dattar. There's a lecture by him titled Successes and Setbacks in Law. Not quite relevant to you now since you haven't even joined law school, but it's still wonderful. It's still something that you could watch if you have the interest in it. That will be all for YouTube recommendations. पहली बार सुन रहे हैं क्या पहली बार?
करुणानंदी का नाम शायद.
Oh, Karunanandi. Oh, okay. Yeah. Karunanandi is.
आप लोग थोड़ा इंटरेस्टेड बनो इन सब चीजों में. ये बहुत हेल्पफुल है आपके क्लैट एग्जाम के लिए. मतलब you will get a broad perspective of things, and that is what the whole point of this exercise is, for you to get a broad perspective of the entire scheme of things that we have in the legal profession. And CLAT may not be directly testing you on that, but a lot of exams do. They ask you about which lawyer published which book. That would be covered in your GK, but there are a lot of books that are written by lawyers because that is their second profession, writing the good ones. So if you want to remember it, then you should know what is written in it. It is helpful to you on a substantive level and also for your CLAT. So please be abreast of all of this.
Most certainly, and just a bit of point over there, it is only the obscure facts that will get you the edge in the exam. For instance, I believe nobody over here knows the full form of P in P. Chidambaram. It was a question asked in 2015 CLAT regarding what is the full form of P in P. Chidambaram. Now, Mr. Kar and I, being both obsessed with Mr. Chidambaram's knowledge on economics, followed him quite a bit, read quite a bit about him, and we obviously knew that P is Palaniyappam. Not a lot of people would know that. So it is only these obscure things that you find after that extra bit of research, that extra mile that you go, that gets you that extra mark, and thus thus a better university, thus in the vast majority of cases taking cerebus paribus resting, everything else being constant, a better job, and you can go down a slippery slope argument as a result of it. But yeah, I mean, just looking back, I'd say even today, Mr. Kar and I are obsessed not just with the law but with lawyers, and perhaps more with lawyers than with the law. Uh, I think even before the newspapers covered the new wedding of Mr. Salve, Mr. Kar got to know about it simply because he followed Mr. Salve so much that he knew everything about him. It is that level of obsession with with lawyers, with the law, which of course some might find too much, but that's a call you shall make. But that is it for today. I have to go to the mandir now. I'll see you sometime again. If you like my lecture, then please do give feedback to Mr. Kar, and I shall come sometime again. Thank you.